today we just had a little kind of introductory material from 3 of these books. Okay, are there other questions? So what we had then is basically some introduction stuff from a couple of the books where they are trying to define mysticism. Okay? Right?
Yes.
Schaeffer and McGinn. Now Schaeffer is examining Jewish mysticism, McGinn Christian mysticism. So the first question that arises from this is, are the two in any way comparable? Now, they both derive from similar roots, biblical roots, but did they develop in such radically different ways that can you even make a comparison? And notice what Schaeffer does at the end of his chapter. What does he do? He quotes McGinn's definition, kind of adopts it for himself, right? So the first thing that Schaeffer says on page, what page are we on? 1. Any attempt to define mysticism in a way that allows the definition to be generally accepted is hopeless. There is no such thing as universally recognized definition of mysticism, just as there is no such thing as a universally recognized phenomenon of mysticism or notion of mystical experience. There are as many definitions as there are authors, he says. What do you think? Does that mean this course is hopelessly misguided?
Yes.
Possibly, yeah. So what's his point? Yeah?
Well, it's just that there's so many different definitions of mysticism, and there's such a variety, since it's not exactly one specific thing, but a conglomerate, that it's difficult to nail down exactly what it is, because you're always going to find something that has an exception to definition or add something to it.
Yeah?
It's kind of going off that, since mystical experiences are so individual and are usually seen as indescribable, it's almost like, again, a very person-by-person basis, and so you can kind of look at trends almost more than it's hard
Yeah.
to have rules.
So it's not first of all, it's not empirical. That is to say, you can't empirically examine, understand somebody else's mystical experience. The assumption that your mystical experience is the same as somebody else's mystical experience is an assumption. It's not in any way demonstrable. Because it's like, I'm in love with person X and you're in love with person Y. We're both in love, but the way that love is felt and expressed and understood may be radically different, and the object of our love is radically different. You see what I'm saying? But is it all love? Schaeffer's main point, however, is that it is a historical thing. That is to say, there's no such thing as universal mysticism, and McGinn agrees with this. It can only be discussed intelligibly if it's related to a specific historical phenomenon. That is, there's Jewish mysticism, there's Christian mysticism. But even within Judaism and Christianity, there are different forms of mysticism. That is to say, there's Merkabah and Kabbalah and Bereshit mysticism, and all sorts of different Jewish types. Okay? Does that make sense to everybody? So, this is discussed in Schaeffer on, where does he discuss it? Mysticism, this is on page 6. Mysticism is a historical phenomenon. And then he quotes Sholem, who's one of the founders of the study of Jewish mysticism. The point I should like to make, says Sholem, is this, that there is no such thing as mysticism in the abstract, that is to say, a phenomenon or experience which has no particular relationship to other religious phenomenon. There is no mysticism as such. There is only mysticism of a particular religious system, Christian, Jewish, Islamic Jewish mysticism, and so on. So both Schaeffer and Sholem say, and in fact McGinn, say it's not a universal thing. It is always expressed, and it's always understandable. Let me put it that way. It's always understandable only as part of a historical phenomenon. Now, do you guys agree with that or not? There is an alternate view, which I call the neo-mystical view, and I've got a paper on neo-mysticism that I'll probably put up on the board at some point. What I mean by neo-mysticism is the understanding and practice of mysticism as understood and practiced beginning in the late 19th century and carrying on especially into the 20th century, and especially associated with Jungian psychology, Joseph Campbell, New Age phenomenon, things like that. Okay, so we'll discuss that more later. We don't need to worry about that right now, but there's a widespread, the pop culture understanding of mysticism that we find in the US today is basically what I would call neo-mysticism. And I use that term simply to distinguish it historically from previous pre-20th century conceptualizations of mysticism, which are really, tradition dependent. Yes?
So would Schaeffer again say that neo-mysticism is in fact not mysticism, but something else entirely?
No, it's a new form of mysticism, but it's a new mystical tradition. But it conceptualized what mysticism is differently than traditional mystics have. Does that make sense? So it's a real mysticism. It's just, let's read a couple of other quotes here from Schaeffer on 7. All religion is in the last resort based on mysticism. Now, he's quoting a guy named Rufus Jones, but he disagrees with that statement. Okay, Schaeffer doesn't accept that, but he's saying this is a view. This is the neo-mystical view. All religion is fundamentally mysticism, and all mysticisms are fundamentally the same. Okay, do you see the difference between Schaeffer's view and that view? That is, a Taoist, a Buddhist, a Hindu, a Muslim, Christian, a Jew, they all have a mystical experience. They interpret that experience based on their own particular religion and ideas and assumptions. But what they are experiencing is exactly the same thing, interpreted and understood differently, because just like you would express it in Chinese versus Arabic, you also express it in Buddhist conceptual worldview versus Islamic conceptual worldview. Then the question that arises for these guys is, what's behind? See, up here you've got God, here you've got mind, and that is a human individual mind or soul, and then here you have a mystical experience. And when a Zen guy does a mystical experience and a Muslim Sufi does a mystical experience, they describe it in certain terms, which the neo-mystics say, okay, they're describing it differently, just like you describe love differently, but they're all experiencing love, even though the object of their love is different, and the way they express their love, write poetry or, stand on the street where you live and sing, whatever it might be. It's different. So the mind is interpreting the experience in different terms because of the different cultures that people come from, or different languages. The big question that arises is there a God behind this, or is it all mind? Is there a barrier here? Are they experiencing the same one God in different ways? Are they experiencing different gods in different ways? Or is it purely a mental phenomenon? And that's another part of neo-mysticism, is it's often an assumption that what you're experiencing is your inner God or your inner self. You're connecting with your inner reality. And then the atheists come along and say, no, it's just aberrant psychology. It's just wacky brain chemistry causing you to have these weird experiences, which you then interpret as mystical. So you really have a number of different interpretations of what's beyond the individual who has this experience that they see as mystical. Is there some reality beyond the brain chemistry or not? That's the big question. And if there is, what is that reality? And is it the same? Or does a Muslim mystic, when he has an experience, is he just having aberrant brain chemistry, but when a Christian has an experience, it's the real thing because he really connects with God, whereas the Muslim doesn't really connect with God, or maybe connects with God in a different way. Or if you're a polytheist pagan type, you may be connecting with a different God. maybe each god, gives you a different mystical experience. See, it's not the Hindu wouldn't necessarily say that there is no Christ. They just say Christ is an avatar of Shiva, and the Christians do their thing, and that's how Shiva wants to express himself in the Christian world. You see what I mean? So the Hindus would approach this even in another way. Okay, does everybody understand the issue at hand here as we try to define mysticism? Do you have any comments or questions about that? You see how it gets complicated real quick? And as I said, I'm not going to try to resolve this. I want you to understand the issues. I have my opinion, but it's probably worthless, as most of my opinions are. Okay, the rest of Schaeffer, he kind of talks about McGinn. So let's turn to McGinn and look at what he has to say. And I put some notes here. First question, is mysticism the hidden core of all religions? Can you have a non-mystical religion? Nobody's going to answer? Okay, I don't know what the answer to that question is, but you understand the question and its importance. The neo-mystics tend to say that all religion is mystical. My personal view is probably that religions have all sorts of different type of spiritual experience, of which mysticism may be one, but it's not by any means the only one. You will see some guys trying to explain Joseph Smith and Latter-day Saints as Joseph Smith was a mystic. And I think that's different than a prophet. The prophet may have overlap with mystical type things, but prophets, I think, are a different category of religious experience and phenomenon. So what you've seen is a bloating of the phenomenon of mysticism, which I think should be defined as narrowly as possible to make it cogent, coherent discussion feasible. You see it bloating to cover everything. Something that explains everything generally explains nothing very well, or something that tries to explain everything. Okay, now, McGinn goes through a number of different ideas here. He talks about the term mysticism and mystical, which is not an ancient term in the way we use it today. It's a neologism. What does neologism mean? A new word, yeah, it's just new word, and it refers to words developed by scholars to try to, define things. So neologism is itself a neologism, but mysticism is a neologism in its modern sense. It is a term used to cover a set of phenomenon that an ancient guy wouldn't have used used it for that purpose. Now, McGinn talks about the way the term mystical originated, and so does Schaeffer a bit, and how it's used by Christian mystics. What is the term, or what's the origin of the term? Mystery, mystikos in Greek, which we translate as mystery. What else?
So it isn't also the Greek term mysterion, which is like kind of happens during a sacrament, or
Yeah, the mysterion could be. We're going to talk about the mystery religions 2 times from now, I think. Religions focused around this, but mystikos in Greek means something like secret, sacred, hidden, and Paul uses that language. I'll give you some references to Pauline use of the term mystical, and it comes out in King James as mystery, and you see it popping up in the Book of Mormon and also Doctrine and Covenants, where they use mystery language for things. That's the root of the term mystical, is this term mystery. So mysterion is mystery, mystikos is things related to the mystery, or mystical. Now that's not the way it's used now, but that's the origin of the term. And it is a Greek term, and it first occurs in a Christian setting in Greek theological and monastic writings and mystical writings, where it is talk about a mystical theology. What they mean by that is a theology of the hidden secrets of God. the hidden things of God. In other words, what they're really saying is esoteric. Mystical and esoteric in its original sense were more or less coterminous, but now we use the term esoteric to describe what was originally mystical, and mystical has shifted. So when you see it in Paul, that doesn't necessarily mean what Paul is saying is the same as Saint Bernard of Clairvaux would say in the 13th or 12th century. Do you understand? Everybody see what I'm getting at there? So you talk about mystical contemplation. What's that? What's contemplation? This is, now, we use these terms meditation and contemplation differently, again, because of neo-mystical pop culture. But contemplation means basically a very intense, focused, I can't think of a... When you get in your mind an idea and you just sit with it and view it and think about it over and over and on and on and on, that's contemplation. Meditation has kind of come to mean emptying your mind of anything in the Zen sense, and that's based on Westernization, New Age misinterpretations of Zen. But at any rate, contemplation, for example, would be you read a scripture, you say a prayer over and over again, and you just think about it and focus your thoughts intensely on that idea. And you try to exclude everything else. So mystical contemplation is contemplating the mysteries, right? Mystical life is living a life that allows you, a super spiritual life that allows you to understand and get involved in the mysteries. Now, as Christianity develops, a whole bunch of different practices get attached to this phenomenon, such as asceticism, fasting. You fast so that you suppress the body and free the spirit, so you can be more connected. Okay? Does that make sense to people? Now, McGinn uses a couple of ideas in here that are worth focusing on for a second. One is that most mysticism, at least when I talk about mysticism, I'm going to mean traditional mysticism, ancient and medieval. When I refer to neo-mysticism, I mean the 20th century interpretation, which has drawn out of traditional mysticism, but is often different. So I won't add the term traditional every time I say mysticism, but just assume that's what I mean. So for traditional mysticism is almost always involved with the esoteric interpretation of a sacred text. It's intimately connected with it, be it the Quran, the Bible, the Old Testament, the Hindu scriptures, whatever it is. There's always an esoteric interpretation of scriptural text involved in mysticism in its archaic original form. Yeah, you had a...
Yeah, so we're going to be using mysticism and esotericism as essentially synonymous?
No, esotericism we'll discuss next time, but by that we mean basically the study, search, interpretation of secret stuff, secret, hidden, elite aspects of religion. Remember, they overlap, but they're not the same. But in its original use in Paul, when you look at mystical language, which hopefully we will in a second, he's using the term mystikos more like I would use the term esoteric today. That makes sense? So he says that number one, mysticism is a way of life. It's not just somebody sitting having experience, it's a way of life. That a mystic has to live differently than an ordinary person. It is seeking the unio mystica. What does that mean? That's a Latin term you find in all these writers. It means mystical union. And what it refers to is the idea that the mystic can become one with God in some way. Now, what that oneness means is interpreted in lots of different ways, but that somehow through the practice of the mystical life, you become one with God. Now, if you look at John 17, the last verses of John 17, You'll see Christ talking about, may you be one with me as I am one with the Father and the Father is one with me, and all this type of language in the last verses of John 17. That's interpreted by Christian mystics as the mystical union, that Christ is telling the disciples to achieve the mystical union with God. And you'll see mystics talk about this all the time, more in Christian and less in Judaism and Islam, but you will see it in all the different groups. So that's another thing he talks about. He, however, prefers the term, instead of mystical union, he prefers the term presence, which is a broader term, which would cover more experiences of the divine. And he prefers the term consciousness to experience. So a consciousness of the presence of God, that's how McGinn would use the term, as opposed to a experience of union with God. McGinn would say consciousness of the presence of God. See the difference? And I think he's using the terms, probably, that is, he is substituting those terms to make it a little bit broader. And another thing he says is mysticism is always transformative. That is, you do these mystical experiences in order to change your nature. It's going to transform you somehow. Okay? But mysticism is not merely the unique unitive experience. It is the whole phenomenon of life, of intense study, ascetic practices, meditation, contemplation, singing hymns all night long. I mean, just go on and on and on. Constant prayer, like these guys will kneel and pray for 24 hours straight, never get up. So, does that make sense to people? Just as background? Yeah.
So, what he's saying is, if you have a mystical experience, in order for it to really count as mysticism, it has to transform your life somehow. Someone could say, have a vision, and have it not affect your life in any way, and that's not mysticism.
Now, neo-mystics might say that's mysticism, but traditional mystics would say no. I mean, you didn't really have the experience if it didn't transform you, right? Now, another characteristic that they allude to here is ineffable. What does that mean?
Describe.
Right. It's sometimes translated, it means you can't describe it. So it's like being in love is often used as an example of this. When you've been in love, you know what it is, but if you haven't, you don't get it. Okay? So the mystical experience is ineffable. What the mystics try to do with their writings is lead people to the point where they can have their own mystical experience. It has to be experienced. It is a personal thing. It doesn't happen as a group. It happens to an individual. It has to be experienced. And the mystic who has had that experience will train other guys who want to follow the mystical path on how to do it. Okay, so ineffability is another thing about mysticism. Now, we need to shift gears here and talk about Goodrich Clark, which he's not really talking about mysticism, he's talking about esotericism, and he's got a number of ideas. Again, these categories all overlap, right? So they're not the same, but they're interlocking, overlapping. And when you look at Goodrich Clark, what he's talking about is esotericism. Now, he defines it more narrowly than I would. That is, he is talking about what he calls Western esotericism, by which he means what? Western Europe, Germany,
Right.
Italy, and everything west. So he doesn't even get into the Orthodox tradition or Islam. And he does Judaism indirectly to the extent that Kabbalah influenced what he calls Western mysticism or Western esotericism. Okay? And what he's talking about is a collection of things that basically derive from the pagan world that survived and were Christianized in the Renaissance and become then a esoteric way of interpreting and viewing the world. So in his discussion, he starts way back in Hellenistic times and talks about a set of ideas that managed to survive out of pagan out of classical paganism, and then get incorporated into this worldview in the West. Okay? Now, he talks about it as being non-rational. And this is a important idea that we need to, again, unpack. Rationalism, what does it mean in the modern West? It means logic. It means also empirical. It also means materialism. It has to be quantifiable. Okay? That's not what it meant anciently. The mystics and the esotericists would say that they are rational. Modern scientists would say they're irrational. That's why he uses the term non-rational or para-rational beside rational. But anciently, there wasn't that distinction made. What the ancients thought, and we'll explain this in a second, is they had a different view of the human self than we do, and the human mind, and so they interpret these things differently and understood them differently. So he's talking about specific traditions of Platonism, Hermeticism, Kabbalah, that get combined together with Christianity in the 15th century and create what we call the Western esoteric tradition, which he defines it as. Now, I'm using esoteric in a broader sense of anything, the belief that there is an inner or secret or hidden meaning to both the cosmos, to God, and to God's writings or scripture. Okay? So that's broader. So Western esotericism, as Goodrick Clark defines it, is a subset of the broader esoteric phenomena as I define it. And some forms of mysticism are esoteric. Not necessarily all, but some are. So the idea that there is a secret, hidden meaning to things originates really back in archaic times, and we can discuss that a little bit later. Okay? Now, he comes up with a couple of terms in his book. Do you guys have any questions about his book before I look at a couple ideas from his book that I want to emphasize? Could you follow what he was talking about? It's a little bit obscure. Yeah?
Could you just comment on the imagination and mediation?
I'm going to talk about that in just a second.
Okay.
Anything else? Okay, first concept what I want to discuss is Prisca Theologia. Now, this means the pristine or primordial theology. Now, theology to the ancient medieval guys meant something different than it does today. Theology means it literally means God talk, discussions of God, but it means understanding God. It doesn't mean discursive philosophical theology like it means today. So there's a mystical theology. There is a mystical way of understanding God. There is also a rational theology. And when you look at a guy like Thomas Aquinas, when he does his scholastic Summa Theologia, he is doing rational theology. But that's not the only way you do theology. It's how you understand God. Okay? Now, the idea of a Prisca Theologia is that there is a primordial revelation and that it's from God, and it infuses lots of different religious traditions that then have transmitted a part or an element of this original revelation. Now, specifically, it refers to the philosophers. The idea is that God revealed philosophical theology to the philosophers through reason, and God revealed a biblical theology to the prophets through revelation. So God inspired Plato and God inspired Isaiah. And the assumption here is that both of them had the same revelation, and if you understand them each correctly, they are compatible. Now that idea originates with scholastic philosophers who tried to combine Aristotle and other Greek philosophical ideas with Christian theology, like Thomas Aquinas we mentioned. But it appears in its Renaissance form a bit differently. So just note that there is this idea. Some people accepted it and some didn't, but the esotericists tended to accept this idea. Okay, there's a hidden meaning in Judaism, there's a hidden meaning in Islam, there's a hidden meaning in Christianity, and the hidden meaning is the same in all of them. Even though the outward stuff may differ quite a bit, the inner hidden esoteric meaning is similar. So they kind of think about it in those terms. Does that make sense to everybody? Any questions on that idea?
Isn't that just like neo-mysticism?
No, neo-mysticism is a bit different. And we're going to talk about the difference between what you can call perennialists and neo-mystics a little later. The movement that is closest to Prisca Theologia is the perennialist movement, which there's some important distinctions between these two that we'll discuss later, though. Okay, so perennialism, the idea that there is a primordial or a perennial philosophy, is something we'll discuss later. Okay, now the idea of gnosis, what's that? It means knowledge, and what it means is, in its esoteric sense, is direct, intuitive knowledge of something as opposed to indirect discursive knowledge of something. So I can describe to you the color red, but unless you see the color red, when you see it, you know it. When I talk about it, you don't know it. So it's two different forms of knowing. Intuitive, direct, experiential is Gnostic or gnosis. Now, that's a broadly important term. What the mystics seek is gnosis, direct knowledge of God, not theology talking about God. So I can talk about God all day. And Joseph Smith kind of said something like this, if you can gaze at the heavens for 5 minutes, you'll know more than all the theology books, on earth, or something like that. Remember that saying? That's what the Gnostics would say. Now, there are specific, so we're talking about gnosis with a small g. There are specific Gnostical movements that are called Gnostics, which are one form of this Gnosticism. So it's used in multiple sense, like all of these words. It gets complicated. But when I use capital G Gnostic, that refers to the specific Christian movement. When I use small g Gnostic, I mean a knower. Okay? So there's that idea of gnosis. Then there's the idea of imagination, which Goodrick Clark talks about a little bit, and he refers to this guy named Henri Corbin, who is a very famous French. He's a perennialist, Corbin is, and he's also one of the world's leading experts on Persian Sufism. That was his specialty. He wrote a number of very important and interesting books, but in one of them he talks about the concept of imagination. And we need to understand that the ancients, when I say ancients, I mean everybody before modernism takes over, say, with the Enlightenment in the 18th century. Like Milton would be an ancient by my terminology. So, ancient, medieval, early modern, all are combined together when I say the ancients. So they shared a bunch of assumptions that we no longer share. And you can't understand what they're saying unless you understand what their assumptions are. Whether they're right or wrong, we can debate, but you got to get how their assumptions differ. And the idea of imagination is part of this. The term imagination derives from the Greek phantasia, which comes out as fantasy in English. And Corbin talks about the mundus imaginalis, the imaginal world, the world of imagination. This refers to the tripartite interpretation of the human being. Now, if you go back to really archaic things like the Hebrew Bible, they tend to have a unitive interpretation of the mind, which they actually call the heart. When you read Hebrew text or even Book of Mormon scriptural text, it talks about the heart. That means the essential being of a person. I mean, it refers to the organ of the heart too, but it's the center. The essential being is the heart. The Greeks broke this up into different parts. I think with Plato and Aristotle were kind of the guys that did this. So imagination is a technical term for one of the aspects of people. And basically there's three. There's the material senses, the imagination, and the intellect. Those are three aspects of human beings. The material senses we share with animals. Okay? So you can see, you can hear, you can smell. And those are base. Those are material and corporeal and simple. Now, notice the modern materialist worldview is that the material senses are superior to the imagination. The ancients would say they're inferior. Okay? So what you can see is not reality. Reality is in the mind. That's what's really real. And so it's an interesting flip-flop on that. The imagination is associated, so senses are associated with the body, imagination with what they call the soul, and intellect with the mind. So imagination is the ability of humans, and the ancient assumption was usually that only humans could do this, to visualize things. For example, a triangle. We can understand what a triangle is, and you can visualize a person. You can make art. The capacity to make art is an imaginal, it's part of the imagination. It's our ability to see things, but also make images of them and conceptualize them as images. Okay? So it's the world of art. And for Corbin, this is a real world. It exists. It is not purely subjective. The modern worldview is that's just all subjective. So now when we say imagination and fantasy, we mean things that people make up, that have no connection with reality. This is the era, the zone of Plato's ideas are imaginal. Okay? Now, the intellect is called nous in Greek, and it is the capacity to do abstract thought, like mathematics and geometry. Those are part of nous, and that is reason. Reason is nous. It is a function of the intellect or the mind. And language is probably part of nous. Now, notice then that the imagination is the thing that allows the connection between the material world and the world of pure thought. This is the world of pure thought. This is the best. This is the world of imagination and images and ideas. That's middle. And then this is the world of the material senses, and that is the lowest, what we share with animals. This we share with God, this we share with animals. This is the intermediary that connects the two and allows us to function in the sensible world, but also in the intellectual world. Now that is a, not universal, but a widespread idea within these ancient traditions about mind. And God is conceptualized as pure mind. And therefore, it is in the mind that we connect with God. Okay? Now notice how Joseph Smith says that God has a body of flesh and bone. He exists in this world and this world and this world, according to Joseph Smith. According to most of these guys, these ancient guys we're dealing with, God exists in this world. Maybe the angels exist in this world, and humans exist in this world. You see what I mean? There's a hierarchy of being, whereas, according to Joseph Smith, there's not. God exists in all, and we call these worlds in the sense not of planets, but in the sense of zones of existence, spheres of existence. So world in its ancient sense doesn't mean the planet. You know, we talk about global warming is affecting the world. That's a modern conceptualization of the planet as the whole thing of existence. Ancients believed that what we call the planet is only one realm of existence, okay? And that there are others beyond that. So notice what the modern world has done is take intellect and change it into pure reason as opposed to revelation from God. Okay, so they've just abstracted all of the divine elements out of this. They've done imagination into just pure fantasy and things we make up, as opposed to our ability to perceptualize a reality, an imaginal reality. And that the senses are the material world, are the most real, and this is the most ephemeral. They flip-flopped exactly what the ancients think. So to an ancient person, this desk is not real. It is ephemeral. Only that which is eternal is real. that which is ephemeral, that is, exists today to day and will change. Like I could take this desk and smash it to pieces and burn it. It would be gone. So it's not real. Reality is that which is eternal and unchanging in a sense. And for the ancients, that was this realm. Okay? So imagination is more real than material world. For the modern perspective, the material world is more real than these worlds. Does that make sense to everyone? So you got to grasp that idea in order to understand what these guys are talking about, because they just view the universe as radically different than the modern empiricists and materialists view the world, right? Okay, now any questions on that? Now, partly that's what Goodrick Clark is talking about, but notice a lot of the times on these books, I'll take an idea, they talk about it, and use it as a springboard to develop some other thought, right? Because he really doesn't go into all of that in his chapter, but he alludes to it, and I want to develop that idea for the purposes of this class. Because the Goodrick Clark book overlaps with what we're doing, but it's not exactly coterminous with it. So, you know, there's probably no book that's doing exactly what I'm going to be doing here.